Hello, and welcome to the Write Club podcast, where we take you behind the pages and into the fascinating world of writing. I'm Mary, and this is Beth, and we're part of the team at Writing Magazine and Writers Online. Hi, Beth, how are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Let me get straight on to introducing our brilliant guest this week. Former barrister turned historical novelist and grandson of the legendary J.R.R. Tolkien, our guest today is Simon Tolkien. Simon's latest book, The Room of Lost Steps, is the second in a duology, the sequel to The Palace at the End of the Sea. The books trace the life of Theodore Sterling from his boyhood in 1930s New York to boarding school in England, an Andalusian village, and on to Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. Simon, welcome to the White Club podcast. Where are you joining us from today?
Well, not Andalusia. Yeah, sorry. I'm in Santa Barbara in California, so right on the other side of the world. But it is kind of it's a kind of Spanish town. It was founded by the Spanish and built with Spanish architecture, and all the street names are Spanish, and so it has a real Spanish feel to it. So probably a good place to write about Spain if you're not in Spain.
And like Theo in the novels, are you equally at home in England, America, and Spain?
No, actually. My experience of Spain is very limited. For a while I lived in England until I was 50, so basically until 2008 or 9, and I've lived in California ever since then, coming back fairly frequently. But as regards Spain, I researched the book very carefully in Barcelona at quite a lot of length. And I have been on holidays in the Canary Islands quite a few times. But my knowledge of Spain is otherwise fairly limited. And so reconstructed out of my mind, out of my research, I'm sorry, I should say.
I love Barcelona.
Yeah, it comes across really vividly in the novels as well. So I thought you must have spent a lot of time there, but it was just very thorough
Yes,
research.
I did. I mean, Barcelona was different because there are three real centers of what happens in the books. The first in the first novel, in The Palace at the End of the Sea, as you were saying in the introduction, Beth, is there's a large section which is set in a fictional Spanish village, which is located in the hills, I suppose about 30 miles north of Malaga. But I do think that kind of world, that kind of village has really disappeared. You wouldn't find anything like that again. Mass tourism and everything has completely changed everything on Spain's southern coast. And the battlefields around Madrid are obviously, there's not much to see there. But in Barcelona, the places where the events occurred are all still there. The function of some of the buildings has changed. Cafes have become banks, and hotels have become office buildings and things like that. But beneath that superficial exterior, everything is still the same. But the funny part is, all these events occurred in July 1936. There's no memorial to it really at all. It's like a forgotten city within a city, and there were these unbelievable dramatic events that took place in July 1936 when the army rose against the civil government and tried to take over in a coup. And the citizens of Barcelona, particularly the anarchist trade unions, fought them on the streets. And it's that street fighting that I tried to bring back to life and to place my hero within a sequential series of geographic events following the roads and the buildings there, so that maps are supplied in the book and you can, in a certain sense, walk through what happened in history. So I think it's a kind of intense historical fiction, which I was really pleased to have the opportunity to create.
Oh, wow, it sounds fascinating. And for anybody who's not read the book yet, The Room of the Lost Steps, would you be able to kind of just give us a little bit of an overview about it?
Yeah, it's the second part of two books. The first book is The Palace at the End of the Sea, and the second, The Room of Lost Steps. I gave them these exotic, wonderful architectural titles because I wanted to make sure that, one, I kind of liked them, and the whole books took like 7 years to write. And so I had plenty of time to come up with titles. But I wanted titles which there would be nobody else would have used those titles before. My book before this, set in the First World War, was called No Man's Land, and I didn't. There's quite a few people who've written a book called No Man's Land, so I wanted to skip out on that. But Palace at the End of the Sea starts in New York City during the Great Depression, and the span of both books runs over a period of nearly 9 years, starting just before the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression in New York, moving to an English boarding school, then on, as I've described, to this fictional Spanish village, and then on into the fighting in Barcelona, and ultimately to the hero, because it's a coming of age story, his volunteering for the international brigades organized by the International Communist Party to fight against the fascists in the battles around Madrid during the first years of the Spanish Civil War.
Oh, wow,
It's
brilliant.
really an entire portrait of a decade.
It is. I feel like I've had a really intense history lesson from reading the
Well,
book.
but I hope seamlessly. I
Yes,
don't
absolutely.
want Beth to be in a situation, in some historical fiction books, where the author kind of walks into the middle of your experience and starts giving you what you call a history lesson. I don't want to be a teacher, and that's why a coming of age story structure is kind of good, because you are able to explain everything because the hero is learning about it as he goes through these experiences. And so the reader hopefully seamlessly does too, without losing that suspension of disbelief, which is kind of vital if you want to take people back into the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you're so invested in Theo's story. You just sort of riding through it with him.
Good. Well, I'm so glad you feel that.
And duologies are quite rare, so I'd love to know if you always knew that the story was going to be just two books.
Well, the answer is no. Very most specifically, no. I wrote a novel which was intended at the beginning to be about the Spanish Civil War. And that was started back in the fall of 2016. And it grew exponentially, like a kind of crazy, out of control plant, I guess. I needed the hero. I needed to understand why the hero would fight in the Spanish Civil War. And because I'd emigrated to America, I wanted to write about an American boy. I thought that was a really interesting challenge. All my books before have been about English boys, or not English boys, about English people, I'm sorry. So I needed to add New York. I was really interested in a boarding school experience. And I also needed to add the village in Spain, because in order for him to participate in the Spanish Civil War, I didn't want him just to participate for ideological reasons. I wanted him to participate because he loved Spain, and indeed because he'd fallen in love with a Spanish girl. So the book grew and grew and grew, and it became a book which is nearly 300,000 words. And it is impossible these days for publishers to publish books which are really more than about 120,000 words. So even these books as they stand are much bigger than usual books. But to publish them as a single book is impossible from a publisher's point of view. And when I finished the book, the original publishers that I had actually turned it down. My editor had left. I think it's just quite interesting from a sort of writing club, perspective. My editor had left. In fact, she'd said in the around 2021, 2020, I'm leaving. Can I have the manuscript? And I said, oh no, this is just growing and growing and growing, and I can't give it to you. So it had grown by the time it was finished to such levels that I think that the original editors, who weren't editors but had taken over, were no longer they no longer felt able to deal with it. And for a long time, for some time, I had my own editor from the point of view of to see if it could be cut down. But I realized that the structure of the book, the different parts of it, it wasn't that it was too long, it's just it had become too big a story. It had covered a whole decade. So the architectural pillars of that, you couldn't take one of them away without undermining the entire structure. So I was kind of stuck with the length. I could improve the characters, improve the narrative, but I wasn't chipping away at the length. So I was in a real dilemma. So I eventually found publishers, but on the basis of them turning it into two books. So it became the two books, and now I think of it as Palace and Room. And I always think of it as two books, but all the way through, right up until the last kind of 10% of the time, it was one book. It happened to my grandfather,
Oh,
with the
really?
Lord of the Rings. I mean, the Lord of the Rings was a single book and it became monstrous. I'm not trying to compare my book to the Lord of the Rings, but the same principle occurred. That was divided into a trilogy. The difficult part of having a duology, I think that's what it's called. I never heard of the word before I arrived at it, before they come up with it, is that you have a period when a book that you envisaged as a whole is only half out, and people are reading it and then are furious. I mean, there's people on Goodreads who said, "I'm taking a star away because you left me on the edge of a cliff." I mean, this kind of thing. So it's a real relief that they're both out and people experience them as two books now. I think
Mm.
that's a real thing for me to celebrate in relation to the publication of The Room of Lost Steps, which occurred 2 weeks ago.
And I'm
Mm.
glad that it was two books because it would have been extremely heavy to read
Yeah,
it.
you drop it on your foot and you scream. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. From a printing point of view, from their risk point of view and everything else, you just can't publish books, these kind of doorstep books. It's not possible. And I really like the fact that they are manageable and, as you say, not too heavy.
Yeah.
And it all worked out well. I think it really helped me, and it wasn't part of how I envisaged writing the books, that there are six separate parts, very clear, distinct parts. And so when the publishers came to me and said we need to we need to split it in two, there was a clear point. It's not an exactly half split on words, but there's a clear half point at the end of part three, at the end of the Spanish village, because that's before the war has started. The Room of Lost Steps is a war book. The Palace at the End of the Sea is a pre-war book, if you see what I mean. And that means that the books actually appear kind of different. I don't know if that was your experience, both in
Definitely.
terms of, of their content and their pace.
Yes. And the fact that he grows up, it's not a massive age range, but he changes as a
Right.
character so much.
And
Second book
the
is,
Room of Lost Steps also takes place over a period of less than 18 months.
yeah, it's much faster paced,
Whereas the
actually.
Palace at the End of the Sea takes place over, you know, more than 7 years.
Mm. We featured you in our October PAFT publication feature in Writing Magazine, where you
Right.
described the immense amount of research involved for the novels and the techniques you employed to build confidence and purpose rather than becoming overwhelmed by such a huge project. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you approach and structure your writing?
Yes. Parts, which we talked about before, were really important. If you've got six parts, they're not like books, but they are complete unto themselves. But with a book of this nature, which is such a huge gallery of characters and events, um, the research element is is vital. And the research actually for this took longer than the writing process. So the research took in excess of 3 years. The writing took nearly about two and a half. Um, and I researched almost all of it before I began writing, except in relation to the Spanish village, because what changed is that I realized I needed the Spanish village. As I went on through the palace at the end of the sea, I realized, for the reason I already gave, that the hero needed to experience Spain for himself, because I was writing about volunteers who volunteered from America, effectively, although they came from Britain and everywhere else, to fight in Spain for ideological reasons. And they arrived in a country that they didn't understand and with people that they couldn't communicate. And from a fulfilling dramatic point of view, that wasn't going to work. So I needed to change that. So I had to stop and research that whole part in the middle. The research process is a mixture. It depends on how much primary material is available. And in some areas, there's way more primary material, especially in relation to the war itself, because the Lincoln volunteers, and indeed I read accounts by British volunteers who fought for the international brigades, there is a wealth of material because those who were able to come back, many died in Spain, but those who were able to come back, some of them wrote first-hand accounts. Almost all of them are out of print, but it's kind of fun these days because through Amazon you can find out where these books are. They're sitting on shelves in depositories in Texas and I don't know where else, and you can get these books which are long out of print, which maybe 20 years ago or before Amazon you wouldn't have been able to locate. And then I was able to read all these books. And when I'm reading them, what I'm after is it's kind of like mining for gold. It's kind of like you're one of those old gold prospectors in the old Californian gold rushes, is that you've got a pan and you're looking for the sparkle. And the sparkle is first-hand immediate accounts of what it was like. And because that's what I need. I need to develop a sense of what it was like. And each time I find that kind of gold, I turn it into a computer file. So there's computer files for the Lincoln Battalion. There are computer files for each section of the whole thing. Then in other areas, research is in a certain sense firsthand. So as I was describing earlier on with Barcelona, I walked all the streets. I got myself a guide. I went through the buildings. And in certain cases, in some buildings, for instance, the Carmelite Monastery or the Güell Palace, where a series of complicated events occurs, I drew myself sketch maps. I walked lengths. I worked out lines of sight and everything. Because if you write a historical fiction novel, I feel there's a contract with you that whatever I write is true, other than the fiction that I've entered into the previous events. If you go right through the book, the things that are attributed to characters, real characters, they said that. So when Captain Merriman in the trenches at Jarama is standing there and he is on the phone to the colonel behind the lines who is ordering him to take a crazy advance and go over the top, he did say it's murder, but it's got to be done. And he was shot down by the bullets as they went up. So, and that phone call did occur. And I was able to get that real history in because Theo is a runner. And so he turned into somebody who was used as a runner between officers in the trenches. So this is just one small example. I wanted to create complete, not just verisimilitude, but to have what happened. So where the anarchist leaders were in Barcelona is precisely where they were at those times in those locations. The way in which the barricade is retaken is precisely as did occur at that time and in that place. And when you're looking up at what was the Cafe Chicago, that is precisely where the anarchists secretly climbed up and put a machine gun, and you can stand in front of the building and see it. In the hotel where Theo stayed in Barcelona, the, the, the building is still there. You can see in photographs where the photograph of Stalin, when it was turned into the headquarters of the Communist Party, was hung over the very window where he had stayed with Maria, or had stayed with when he was living there with his parents. So I wanted to create something entirely real, and that makes it more challenging. So in Barcelona, actual physical investigation was really vital. And in other instances, I say it's research. Then there is another layer, which is to understand the history, but that's kind of a premise. But the history of the Spanish Civil War is extraordinarily complex, which is why I think that novelists have avoided it. And when up to now, because it is clearly so challenging to take people into a history that even the people at the time found difficult to understand. So that was difficult. So I read quite a lot of secondary history books by Hugh Thomas and Anthony Beevor and that. But that really doesn't take me anywhere. It just makes me understand the landscape, not how to fill it. And then there's the challenge in something like A Spanish Village. There's much less material. So you have to really mine about. There was an amazing man called Gerald Brennan who lived in Andalusia in that time and wrote an account of it. That was hugely helpful. Things like that. Theo is also, as I mentioned, a runner. So I read a lot of books about running, this kind of thing. So research takes you in many, many difficult directions. It's the second stage of the writing process. And each stage has its great difficulty. The difficulty with research is to know when to stop and when to start writing, because in this kind of world where you're building a portrait of the 30s, you can carry on reading accounts of the New York Depression forever. So I had to know when to stop. I had to know when I had enough. That was difficult. Each part of the process is difficult. The scariest part is the plotting, which is the shortest part, because the plot, the initial synopsis, one, it has to be bare bones enough. My mother was a sculptress, and I always remember her making these armatures before she would actually begin a physical sculpture. And the book is like, the synopsis is like an armature. There's no flesh on it. It's a bone structure. So if you put too much flesh on it, you're stuck with the flesh as you try to write later. You must make it so that you can carry on and develop outwards, but it gives you a structure, if you like, a roadmap as well. But the problem is it right? Is it going to work? Because it is such a skeletal structure, it's impossible to know whether it will work and will support the drama of a full-scale coming-of-age novel. And um, each beginning is a wing and a prayer, if you like. And and obviously there's the problem with the plotting of what am I going to write about as well. It doesn't come with inspiration. It doesn't come that you walk along the road and you say, yeah, that's it. In terms of what you write about. So the plotting is tough. And then as I described the research, then there's the writing and the writing process. But throughout the writing process, with a book this large, you have to be familiar with what it's like living in a very big house. And there are many, many rooms. And there is relationship between the rooms. And some of the characters are going to come back, which is, again, extremely difficult with a coming of age book of this nature. So you have to be very clear, and you have, as I write, create, if you like, further synopses of what are in these rooms so that I can cross-relate to them. And then there's editing. This book has been through an enormous amount of editing. It's been through 2 full rounds of one with my own editor, one with an editor supplied by the publisher, and with intensive copy editing. The copy editing at the end became vital, curiously, because I realized that despite my attempt to write as an American, I didn't know that certain phrases, or many phrases, are not just in the context of the 30s, but are British phrases which Americans wouldn't use. And so I was really grateful to them that they were constantly able to say British phrase, so that made a real difference at the end. It's an enormous, long process. And then finally, this publicity, which, but it's done.
Yeah.
It's not the same. It's quite like being an architect and building a huge house in which the pillars and the structure are not just supporting the particular area where they are, but are supporting a whole. And it becomes very strange when it's finished. It's as if you've left a world behind. So there is your own sense of loss and separation as well, which is strange.
I'd love to know a bit more about you as a writer. You
Huh?
trained and worked as a criminal barrister. So was
Mhm.
that career shift to writing a sudden pivot, or was it a more gradual development?
It was kind of sudden. I didn't write a word of fiction of any kind until I was 40. So I guess quite very few of the people who come on your podcast have had that experience. But clearly I can write fiction. I mean, how well my readers judge, but I can write. So there was something inside me which I was suppressing because I didn't think I could write fiction. And I suppose having my grandfather as the writer of as you know, the author of The Lord of the Rings didn't help in a way in being in his shadow. I think that when I was young, I wasn't confident and I wasn't that successful, particularly in my Catholic boarding school in England, which I revisited in this novel. Um, and I think the legacy of that lack of confidence was a sense that I couldn't write, because if you're not confident, you can hear what you're writing, you're self-conscious. And if you're self-conscious, you can't write. And I think that kind of defeated me. I think what was a huge, and obviously during the publicity process, which has been going now 6 months, I've had quite a lot of a chance to think about how things developed for me in my life and how this worked out in relation to that question. I think being a barrister in London, um, and dealing with criminal law, mainly defense, and being up in front of a jury and it all being on you and everything having to happen live. So you have to cross-examine and change what the jury's view of a witness is in a live context, had an enormous effect on me and my confidence. And I think that confidence was what I needed in order to start becoming a writer. But when I did become a writer, which was in around the turn of the millennium, to begin with, I was lacking in confidence. My first book, which I thought was going to be great, was turned down by everybody, and they only started to read it because I was the grandson of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is, gets you so far, but not past a publisher. I wrote about what I knew, which is sensible. That's good advice. But I was also using props. So I used the prop to begin with in my first two novels of courtroom drama because I wasn't confident enough to write dialogue properly. So I was writing. The courtroom helped me because I knew how people spoke inside a courtroom. Later, I found that courtroom context, confining and like not quite a straitjacket, but I wanted to get out of it. So the courtroom vanished from my books after my second book. It's pretty good. I mean, they're good books, but they use an artificial kind of courtroom context. And then I was also using the thriller, suspense plot, often focused also around a criminal trial as a context because the plot supported my writing because I knew that how the book was going to develop would be in relation to a plot. And that gave me the idea of pace. And that was how you knew how to keep things going. So the characters were in a certain sense subordinate to the plot. But then I got good at that, and the characters started to run the show. So in the books that in the last three books I have written, they are character driven. I guess this is where you go out of genre fiction and you go into literary fiction, if you like. I think my books are probably literary fiction now as well as historical fiction. And at the same time, and this wasn't really in order it wasn't a liberating development. It was more. I turned to history because I left the law, I left the police, and I also turned to history. And I think that I'd always been really interested in history when I was a kid. It was what I liked most of all. And so I went back to that. But in terms of the writing structure process, it was moving away from artifices like plots and moving into character-driven fiction in a historical context. And then the research, as I went into history, became greater and greater and greater. So now we have these that I'm spending over 3 years, a length of a degree, doing the research. So it's been a long, slow process over 25 years.
What does a typical writing day look like for you, Simon?
Um, when I'm writing, as opposed to researching, um, I tend to start up pretty early in the morning and try and write for about 3 hours and produce, if I can, at least 1,000 words. And then I walk away. And then usually that takes, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 hours. And I don't worry about it too much. And then I will come back in the evening and read it over. And almost always it's better than what I thought. And I will start revising it and working at it in the evening. But I leave a gap between the actual writing and the revision of it in each day. Though obviously, as per what I was describing before, there are other things going on. There are relating it to my research files. There are then building up short synopses of what I've written so that I can cross-refer. There's vast amounts of cross-reference going on. And that's obviously built into it. But in terms of the writing, I just try and go at it. I know the target. I know what I want to write about. I've got access to the research materials that are relevant to that. And then I read it back. And then I revise it. And then I start the next section the next day. I've always been struck by Anthony Trollope's autobiography, which was his ruin. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't.
He was one of the most prolific of the Victorian novelists. And he wrote many, many novels and was extremely popular, rightly so. He's a great master of character. He's one of my favorite novelists. But he chose, I think mistakenly, to write an autobiography. And in it, he described how he, churned out a particular amount of words every day. And it was kind of like a sort of factory process. And people said people's view of him changed as a result of that. And they thought he was just a churner rather than a writer. But I've always thought it is important, just like he did, to use each day, which is not being used for research or other reasons, to reach targets. Because if you are writing a large book, it can become impossible otherwise, because you have to keep going up the side of the mountain. And there are kind of base camps. If you are, oh, I've got to get to the end, your writing is going to suffer. So you have, like a mountaineer, to find base camps that you're headed to. As I described earlier on, there are 6 parts. So those became like individual books. But within those, each chapter can be an episode in itself. And that's one of the reasons why, in a kind of Victorian manner, this book, every chapter in this book has a title. So each one was like reaching the end of something. And that, I think, is really important, to be able to keep going. Because people say to me now, how could you write over how could you do a project over 7 years? It's only possible by segmentation, and an enormous amount of segmentation, of building blocks and then putting the blocks together in that kind of structural context. And the end is so far away that it's kind of meaningless. So you have to come up with other ends. And you have to believe in your own writing. And I think that it was really good that I'd been a writer for a long time before I started this. because you have to, what I was talking about self-consciousness earlier, and I've thought about this a lot. I'm not sure I know the answer. That's integral to being a good writer, because if you are self-conscious and lacking in confidence, the words won't flow. You can't get that flow which makes good writing, because when flow begins, things in an alchemical way start to just come together. You find that you are writing a scene and something, and that it ties into something that you hadn't seen before. This happens constantly. That things are happening effectively, clearly in your unconscious, in terms of meeting points and developments that happen. And this is a magical part of it, but it can't occur without flow. So in order to have the flow, you can't be self-conscious, but at the same time, you have to hear the language. You have to hear what you're writing in your head so you can weigh it, because then the prose, that's what makes the prose good and compulsive. And those two appear to be, that you can hear the prose in your head, but that you're not self-conscious, appear to be a self-contradiction. Does that make sense? Do you see
Yeah,
what I'm trying to say?
definitely.
And it's a marriage of contradictions that makes it possible. And other areas really help. I mean, like being a lawyer gave me organization and research organization, all of that. But in terms of writing, it's that fusion of the two. And when I was talking about getting beyond plot and into character before, I think this is what makes that possible. And then the characters live. And that's what really is the great joy. That's the most marvelous thing, is because I can think of the characters in the palace at the end of the sea and the room of lost steps, and they live.
Yeah.
They appear to in front of me, and they're entirely in flesh. I can connect to them, and that's, to create life like that is a wonderful, wonderful thing, for which I shall always be grateful. But it takes a long time and a lot of experimentation.
Can you give us a sneak peek into what it is that you're working on next?
But the publicity has been quite intense, and intense in the sense that I've had to do quite a lot of writing my own material. For instance, at the minute, I'm doing something for the Wall Street Journal, which is quite challenging and interesting, which is writing about what my 5 best books on the subject of rivalry is. So, that makes you go back and read books over and think about that in a new way. So the whole publicity process, it's not sort of getting on aeroplanes because everything is Zoom, but there's a lot of written work. I've done written work for you as well. And that's interesting and makes you look at it. But it's also incompatible with what I was describing earlier, which is the process of trying to build a skeletal synopsis. So I think all I know at the minute is I have throughout the year been thinking about where to put the next book. And I had a book, No Man's Land, which was set in the First War. The book before No Man's Land, called Orders from Berlin, which was a plot to assassinate Churchill, was set in the Blitz. And then this book is set in the 30s. And I think where I'd like to go next is I'd like to go into the Second World War, but possibly in France or in one of the in the Netherlands or Belgium, I'm not sure, and set it in Nazi occupied Europe. But in the focus being on whether you resist or you collaborate, and also what the function and relationship would be to those agents who are sent in from the outside, who have different issues at stake in relation to how they act. And that some people, the effect on Jewish people, the effect of being a communist, how that affects it. And I think those relationships are really interesting from a character point of view. And I'm, as I previously described, very interested in characters. There's a TV show called The French Village, which I think is on Netflix, which you can, which is in French, which is really good. It's set in a village on the border between Vichy France and Nazi-occupied France. And it's about all these issues covered in a really interesting way. And I think that's a really interesting place for me to go. But I'd have to start the research and all that long process that I was describing, but that's where I want to go next.
That sounds fascinating. Look forward to that after all the research has happened.
Takes a while.
Yeah, yeah. We always like to end the podcast by asking for a book recommendation. Do you have anything that you'd like to share?
Well, as I say, for the Wall Street Journal, I've been reading these fascinating books on the subject of rivalry. So the books I've been interested in. I read The Quiet American just recently. I don't know if you know that about the early stage of the Vietnam War before the Americans were there, although involving an American, and one of those extraordinary love triangles where the motivation of one character is he doing something for selfish motives or for idealistic motives, which is so typical of Graham Greene. And then recently I've been looking at the play Julius Caesar and the figure of Brutus. And before that, I've also been reading a wonderful book set in a New England boarding school called A Separate Peace, which is an old classic, American classic, about a friendship between two boys that goes wrong. And before that, for my own fun, while everything else has been going on, I have read and loved and enjoyed a book called The Woman in White, which is by Wilkie Collins, which was written in 1850. Wilkie Collins was a marvelous man, close friend of Dickens, and he acted with Dickens, and he was the father, if you like, of the detective story, long before and of the suspense plot. Everything that I wrote about and really enjoyed in my first 4 novels. And The Woman in White is an immaculately and extraordinarily well constructed story, which has you on the edge of your seat, about a plot to take the money from an heiress. And it has wonderful settings and marvelous, memorable characters. And I read it first, I suppose, about 30 years ago. And then I always thought, this plot is so amazing. But then I realized at the beginning of this year that I had, or not the beginning of this year, when I started reading it again and started to give it a try, that I had forgotten it all. And I think this comes with age. I call it fictional forgetfulness. And it's a wonderful thing. If it obviously gets worse, it's not going to be good news. But in respect to being able to go back to wonderful novels that you've enjoyed before, it's a blessing. And I hugely recommended it. He also wrote a wonderful book called The Moonstone, which is also mysterious and suspenseful. And that's what I'm going to read next.
Oh, brilliant. That's actually such a good point. I would love to, some of the books that I've read
Right.
in the past, I'd love to be able to just read them again for the first time. So maybe if I give it like 5 to 10 years, maybe I'll have
Yeah.
forgotten what's happened and then I can read it again like it's the first time I've read it.
What I was really surprised by with The Woman in White is that it has such a powerful and extraordinarily well constructed plot, which I remembered, but I didn't remember the details of the plot. And I was slightly surprised by that.
Wow,
But lots of pleasures arrive if you can go back to places you liked before.
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Simon, for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you on the Right Club podcast.
It's been a real pleasure to be on it too, and thank you for asking such interesting questions.
Yeah, it's been brilliant having you on. Thanks again. Thanks for tuning into the Right Club. We hope you enjoyed this episode and feel inspired to keep writing. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at Writers Online, your go-to for writing tips, competitions, and exclusive updates. Plus, you'll never miss an episode of the Right Club. Until next time, happy writing.